You all seem to be settled down. We apologize for rushing all of us, but we're happy we have the time to vote to the agenda. And the next item on the agenda is a very, very pertinent, very interesting. It's a bit ambiguous. It says either the reformation of the financial system or the reformation of the financial system. There is a nuance there. We'll hear more about it shortly. We have two very distinguished central bank governors here to discuss this point, very distinguished, very influential, who've had a major impact on the global financial system. And again, I'm not going to go into any long introductions. You know them very well. Governor Tarullo of the Federal Reserve System, who's been in the forefront of reformation or reformation, however you put it. And of course, Jean-Claude Trichet, the honorary governor of the Banque de France, as well as the governor, they call him the president there, of the European Central Bank. And with that, gentlemen, we look forward to having a discussion with you on one or the other of these subjects.
So, it's an immense pleasure and honor to have Daniel Tarullo here. Apart from the presentation which was just made, let me, Daniel, mention that we worked together in the GHOS extraordinarily actively in a situation which was absolutely dramatic, with the collapse of the financial system and the necessity to find out ways to have a system which would be more resilient, which would pave the way for a steady state which would not be as crazy as what we had to cope with, which would protect the taxpayer risk as well as the taxpayer money, and which would not hamper the recovery, which was more or less the constraint that we had. You summed up all that admirably, and I will quote you, when you said, and you were referring to previous dramatic crises, like the Asian crisis, and also to the situation in which we were in 2008-09, and particularly in January 2009, when you were appointed governor, you said it sounds like a cliche, but you got to keep your cool. You've got to be still to the fact that there are going to be a lot of bad news and a lot of bad stuff happening, and you've got to absorb it and move through it. And it is what we tried to do, all of us at the time, and what all our colleagues are still doing. And everybody knows that you are absolutely fundamental, if I may, as a personality and as a brain. You were visionary. As soon as 99, when you had the new legislation which was passed in the US, you said that we were creating an unstable equilibrium. And it was 8 years before the start of this, the materialization, if I may, of this instability. So, my dear Daniel, again, can I ask the first question, as simple as that, if I may? How do you characterize the present situation of the reformation of the overall prudentials and financial regulations, seen in the US perspective on the one hand and on a global perspective on the other hand?
So I'd say, Jean-Claude, to begin, first, thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming today. I'm going to use both the terms, both the reformation and the reformation, because I think both are probably continuing efforts, which are not yet complete, and in some instances probably we're not quite sure yet where the end point will be. I think we're continuing to see in the U.S. but in Europe and more generally around the globe, a rethinking of the basic strategies and business models of a lot of regulated financial institutions. That is, as Jean-Claude alluded to a moment ago, that is complicated by continuing macroeconomic challenges, which make it more difficult to see what the steady state will look like. And that it does pose a particular challenge, I think, for the regulatory reform agenda, because there's always a temptation to say we don't want to put the reforms in place now. We don't want to do anything which would further weaken the financial institutions, the financial systems more generally. And yet, if one doesn't immediately begin to force the cleaning up of balance sheets, force the recapitalization of firms, and force the firms to reorient to what is going to be the period beyond the crisis, I think one risks getting bogged down for a much longer period of time with institutions that aren't making those kinds of adjustments. In terms of where we are internationally and here in the U.S., I don't want to put a fraction on it, but I would say that in the Financial Stability Board, with some of the initiatives that are going to be publicly released over the next few days and weeks, we are coming to a point in which I think we've laid out a broad framework for strengthening the globally active, systemically important institutions with capital and liquidity, with a TLAC, the total loss absorbency framework that should be coming out relatively soon. With some of the activities on risk management, I think we've identified and put forth, as I said, the frameworks for a more resilient, and thus more stable set of globally active financial institutions. Much of this still needs to be implemented. The well-known, much commented on long transition periods means that we're still 5 years away from full implementation of a lot of these measures. And thus, capital is going to still need to be built up in order to meet the requirements as they'll exist in 2017, 2018, and into 2019. But with all the difficulties in getting to where we have, I do think that the set of initiatives that's come out of the Basel Committee that the Financial Stability Board has been involved with has, in important ways, reshaped where we are internationally in terms of what our expectations are for the largest systemically important institutions. I'm not going to address right now, because I know you want to get to it later, what still needs to be done and what may be missing. In the U.S., I think we're probably at about the same point. As many of you probably know from what Chair Yellen and I have said publicly, we've got some additional initiatives, which in some cases are going to be stricter or stronger than those of their international parallels that will still be coming out. We're going to have higher SIFI surcharges, SIFI capital surcharges, than the international agreement has called for. What we will do on TLAC will probably be a little bit more rigorous with respect to some of the qualifying instruments. But in general, what we will be doing is paralleling each of these major elements of the international framework with our own domestic implementation. I think for us, a big remaining challenge, and I think this probably applies internationally, is in the area of resolution, of making the resolution of a very large financial institution in a non-disorderly fashion a credible expectation. We and the FDIC, the Fed and the FDIC, have now with substantial specificity told our largest firms what we think they need to do to get in that position. Europe is starting to wind up its resolution mechanism, and it's got its own regulatory system in place, creating the expectations for how that will be done. Other jurisdictions are to a greater or lesser degree pursuing their own structures. But this is still a work in progress, and there is a considerable amount of work to do, I think, before we can look at one another and say credibly, this task can be accomplished without itself fomenting enormous disorder in the financial system.
No, thank you very much indeed. As you already said, I would be very interested in having your views on the work in progress in other fields than the commercial banks, and more generally, including, of course, the very large and systemically risky institution, namely derivatives. What would be the judgment on the global proceeding in the direction of having a much better handling of derivatives, and also, I would say, more generally, the non-banks. Right. We concentrated on banks, and we concentrated in a fashion which has not been as intense on the rest, all the non-banks, which in my own understanding are also, of course, a potential cause for systemic risk, which is monumental. So how would you characterize that?
A couple of things. I think, first, I don't think we should understate the accomplishment in getting in relatively short order an international agreement on over-the-counter derivatives margining. And we're now moving down the path of having an international agreement on minimum margining for securities financing transactions. To some degree, these initiatives spring out of an examination of the vulnerabilities of the largest financial institutions, but as reflected in Jean-Claude's question, they really can broaden into application to the financial system more generally. I think we all expect that as the stronger capital, stronger liquidity, stronger risk management requirements are implemented by the regulated financial institutions, there is going to be a certain amount of migration of certain kinds of activities out of those regulated institutions. We as regulators and as central bankers then need to ask ourselves two questions. First, how much of that is going on and how quickly is it occurring? And secondly, are we concerned about the new locales in which this activity is being conducted? That is, one can imagine certain kinds of activity moving to relatively unleveraged institutions that might be exposing themselves to substantial losses, but after all, it's everybody's right to take a risk so long as the risks they're taking are not creating broader risks in a sort of domino fashion. But there may be other instances in which the migration is to a set of institutions or markets that are as or even more fragile than the leveraged regulated institutions from which those activities came. Over-the-counter derivatives, securities financing transactions have seemed to me two arenas in which the migration could be very quick indeed, and in which systemic vulnerabilities could be replicated quite quickly. And thus, it's been our judgment, both in the US and internationally, that an international convergence of views on the need for minimum margining in those areas is going to be an important next step in addressing these kinds of risks. I'd say, Jean-Claude, that more generally with respect to the shadow banking system, and like a lot of what was the shadow banking system 7 or 8 years ago has either disappeared or substantially been substantially reduced. We don't see SIVs today in a way that we used to. They were swept away by the crisis and its aftermath. At this juncture, one might say that the shadow banking system is relative to 7 or 8 years ago, and I suspect relative to 7 or 8 years from now, in a relatively intermediate position. But as I say, with the application of the regs, the impulse to financial innovation, the development of new asset classes and interest in new assets, it is almost inevitable that a new set of practices, a new set of transactions, a new set of institutions will either grow beyond what they are today or develop anew. So I think this ongoing task is one that's going to pose a challenge for all of us, because we're going to have to be monitoring, almost monitoring for arbitrage, and then making the normative judgment as to, so that's the positive side of it, and then the normative side of it is this migration or development of something new in and of itself troublesome? And I think we've got both type 1 and type 2 error risks here, Jean-Claude. I think there's the risk of every time something new starts to happen, wanting to jump in and stop it, which will not be a productive way for a national or international economy to move forward. But there will also be the risk that we sort of say to ourselves, well, you know, it's not JP Morgan, it's not Barclays, it's not MUFG, therefore it can't really pose a threat to the financial system. So I think that's going to be a big challenge nationally and internationally, precisely because it's going to be an iterative process.
I think what you said is very, very important, because we still need, of course, a full understanding, I would say an academic understanding of the new world which we are creating. You were lucid enough in '99 to say we are paving the way for an unstable equilibrium in global finance. And we have to remain vigilant and to be sure that they are not new emerging property of the very complex world in which we are, which could appear, as you said in advance, 7 years in advance, which could appear prone to systemic risk and to new real big problems. My intuition is that it is for very good reason that we concentrated on banks. It should not be that we have attention only on banks. The political economy of what we are doing is very much concentrating also on banks, because banks are seen by our fellow citizens are more or less the main culprits.
They are, and understandably so. I mean, the too big to fail assumptions surely were an important factor behind the response to the crisis and the response to the big banks and all the rest. But the intellectual point that I think Jean-Claude and I are both making is that you can conceive of a financial system in which you could say with credibility, no single institution is too big to fail, we could handle it. And yet there would still be systemic vulnerabilities because, for example, of a funding structure that was very fragile, under-margined, in which runs were incentivized. You know, the Marcus Brunemeyer, the wonderful characterization he has of the maturity rat race is something that can take place in markets and not just within institutions.
And you have, of course, this capacity to have 100% correlation between the behavior of all the market participants and institutions, which is also something which is dangerous in terms of systemic risk. But can you elaborate, Daniel, on the overall issues of level playing field? Mm-hmm. Global cooperation, which is institutionalized in the Basel Committee, in the GHOS, in the FSB, and in the G20 as the ultimate decision maker, if I may, or informal decision maker. But how would you respond to the criticism that there are elements of resegmentation of global finance that are very dangerous?
Well, so I think, let me say a few things about level playing field, which maybe aligns into the segmentation point. On level playing field, there are some areas, and I've identified a couple of them. Anything that's transaction-centered in which there are minimum margins and where you can book the activity virtually anywhere, that is just an invitation to arbitrage. And you're going to have more or less far-reaching, more or less comprehensive, more or less universal participation in arrangements like that. There are other areas, and I would say capital structure, and as I was alluding to a few moments ago, the exact composition of instruments that are available for conversion into equity in a resolution context, where one doesn't need to internationally have precision and total convergence around a particular approach or even a particular level. I noted a few moments ago that in the United States, we're going to quite likely, the Fed will quite likely have a ladder of surcharges that is higher than the Basel agreed ladder. But we're coming on the heels of, Stefan Ingves is sitting there, and Sweden having on its own taken steps to strengthen the capital position of their banks beyond international minima. Switzerland has done the same. Other countries are thinking about doing the same. We're trying to take the notion of Basel Committee agreements as a minimum level, which is always the way they've been characterized since 1987, and to build on those in a way that is appropriate for our financial markets and our firms, but also, I would say, probably serves as a bit of an opportunity for other countries to think about what they will do. An example I've given publicly in the past has been the initiatives of the Bank of England. Actually, it was the FSA even before prudential regulation was folded back into the Bank of England, in looking at the liquidity positions of both UK and foreign banks in London and going beyond what was going to be required in the Basel agreements, precisely because of the nature of their activities. And they were good enough to share their thinking on that with us, and it taught us a lot. So the level playing field is not a static concept. It's not a universal concept. It's not a static concept. I want to come back to that in a second. Segmentation, I will say, I think there's been a basic misunderstanding on this. Because let me just paint a slightly simplified picture. But if the picture is, well, gee, we're having these regulations today which seem to be limiting the capacity of major institutions to do what they would otherwise do in their cross-border activities. There's implicit in that a bit of the following notion that, well, we had this wonderful system in the late 90s and the early 2000s in which there was home country consolidated supervision against the backdrop of a set of Basel agreements, and then with that we basically allowed firms to move their capital and liquidity around as they will. That didn't end so well. It didn't end so well, and it reflected a lot of weaknesses in both the substantive agreements and the modes of supervision. And so we have to think about how we're going to remedy what was clearly an inadequate answer to the oft-quoted Mervyn King observation about how we have institutions that live globally but end up dying locally. And I would extend that to the proposition that no matter how good a home country consolidated supervisor you are, you do not have as subtle an understanding of what's going on in a foreign market as the regulators and central bank in that country do. Again, I'll take London as an example. We need to talk to the Bank of England about what is going on in London with respect to our institutions, because they have a better sense of the dynamics of the London market. It is wholly appropriate that the UK authorities place liquidity expectations over and above Basel requirements. A couple of other points. Remember, the Basel agreements never said what I just in kind of parody fashion suggested was the model. The Basel agreements, whether they were the supervisory agreements or the substantive capital agreements, always had roles for both home countries and host countries. Host country responsibilities for supervision and regulation have always been an important part of Basel. That is the way in which one performs one's obligations to the rest of the world of assuring financial stability in one's own market. The other point I'd make is that Basel I and the original Basel Concordat, these are the initiatives of the 80s and the 70s, were developed and implemented in a period in which the nature of transborder bank activity was very different from what it evolved to be in the succeeding decades. In 2000 or so, 15% of foreign banking organization activities in the United States were what we would loosely call capital market activities, broker-dealers, other capital market. 85 was conventional commercial banking, usually providing lending to other companies from one's home country or developing a commercial banking business here in the United States. By 2007, that percentage had grown to 50. It was a fundamentally different kind of operation, posing fundamentally different kinds of risks, in which the idea of a consolidated home country supervision that can capture everything, I think it was just illusory to think that that could be the case. So our effort now is to have global agreements, global minimums, consolidated capital, consolidated supervision, cooperation, but also to recognize that when there are major operations of foreign institutions in London or New York or Singapore, wherever it may be, it is prudent and I would say necessary to have a significant amount of home country involvement and the expectation that a firm that is a $400 billion firm in the United States alone is going to have a regulatory overlay.
You're very convincing on the absolute necessity, of course, of having a full vision of the risks that are at stake. At the same time, we know that there is some kind of anti-globalization move that we see in many dimensions. And I think that we have all a stake, of course, of preserving the appropriate interconnection between all economies in the world. And after all, it is in the time of the crisis that the Basel Committee was transformed, and from a grouping of industrialized countries, it became an informal grouping of all countries, all, I would say, emerging and advanced economies, as well as at the same time the G7 passed the baton to the G20. And so we have both moves, if I may, a tendency to go against some of the aspect of globalization, at the same time the recognition that we have all to work together, as you said very well, Daniel. Can I ask colleagues here, participants, whether they have questions for Daniel Tarullo? Who wants?
For Jean-Claude Trichet?
No. Certainly not. Yeah, please.
Just putting a further fine point on what you were discussing, Governor, and I can't resist with Jean-Claude being on stage at the same time. Ultimately, squaring the definition of prudent bank capital between the Anglo-American world and the European Union at this point is really going to be, especially the core nations, is really going to be the telling factor in whether or not we're able to have a global regulatory environment that you described. So the real question is, how are we going to reach that gap? And we have a very different stomach at this point in the United States for tolerable levels of bank capital relative to the core of the European Union. So I'd love to hear your comments.
Oh, okay. So
outside of the Basel framework.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things about that. I mean, I think everybody's views are evolving. And I mentioned a couple of countries that were perhaps the S countries that were perhaps more in the lead. The U countries, the UK and the US, which have their own ideas as well. But this is going to be a process that continues. Number one. Number two, I do think that jurisdictions understandably feel an ability to either press down a little bit more on the accelerator and move a little more quickly, or to take it off a little bit more, depending on the macroeconomic conditions that are prevailing in their countries at the time. I alluded earlier to cleaning up of balance sheets. I've always thought that's something which, whether you're a sovereign or a company or a bank or a household, generally speaking, you want to try to do that sooner rather than later, rather than just have these debts sitting on your balance sheet. But when it comes to building up levels of capital, for example, that's, I can understand, I can see that there may be some different judgments that are made. And you know, we in the United States, the approach the Fed has really taken is we did, you know, with the SCAP, we had our first the first stress test, which we did in early 2009. That was the first and in some ways the most dramatic effort to ensure that capital, real capital, common equity, was higher than it had been and that it had been understood to be, and that would seem to be adequate to keep the banks afloat. But we have progressively since then tried to continue to build up the capital in a way that allowed the banks to do it mostly through retained earnings in an environment in which they were making money. And I think it's worked well for us. I don't think that we have constrained credit availability on the one hand. On the other hand, we're continuing in a steady fashion to really move capital levels up to a much more robust level. And so with trying to have some sympathy for our colleagues in Europe, their macroeconomic state is not where ours is, or where the UK's is, or where Switzerland's is. And I think that the commitment is still there to have stable institutions that would not require a taxpayer bailout, but people may want to move at somewhat different paces. And I just want to add one other thing, because it gets to this issue of, you know, what's enough and do you trust one another? So Jean-Claude alluded to the GHOS, and I had the pleasure of sitting through for about 3 years the GHOS with first Mervyn and then Jean-Claude participated. Now Mario, of course, chairs the GHOS. When we had the GHOS and issues would arise, Jean-Claude would make sure that we talked about the issues in a very substantive fashion. And he usually tried to push off the particular national concerns until the moment at which was often after a couple of hours. And he did have this technique of not letting us have lunch until we had actually finished the issue. But it would require us to focus on the common interests and the common approach to regulation, where there were shared interests. There are national interests, to be sure, but there are important shared regulatory interests. If we develop, either bilaterally or multilaterally, a set of relationships where we're really regarding one another as working together, both with respect to the framework and with respect to particular institutions, I think things like the differential levels of capital begin to work themselves through because people begin to have more of a common view of things. And I also think things like resolution plans become a lot easier to deal with because we have more confidence that our counterparts in London or Bern or Zurich or wherever do understand what it is that we're all trying to achieve together. So the thing that I think is a little bit missing are the fora internationally where there's a collective effort at a senior level to have the kind of discussions that we had in GHOS and that in what I would term the original steering committee of the FSB back in 2010, we also had. Because without that sense of a shared enterprise, there's going to be more of a risk of regulatory fragmentation that is based upon a lack of confidence in what the other guy is doing.
I think you were very, very convincing. Let me only say that to understand Europe on the one hand, the US on the other hand, a simplification would be the US is financed by banks at the level of perhaps 20%, 25%, by markets 75, 80. It's exactly the contrary in Europe. So even without any cycle differences, even without any other differences, the structure of financing of both economy makes, of course, that banks are playing a much more important role in Europe than in the US, and that the effort that you are doing through banks is superior in terms of proportion, of course, in Europe in comparison with the US. And I expect that there would be progressively some kind of convergence between the two sides of the Atlantic, but it is, of course, an issue which today is an important one. And still we need, of course, global rules, global prudentials, otherwise we are in a world which would not be manageable. But thank you very, very much indeed. I don't know whether we still have the time for one question. Would you authorize that? Yes, one. So, one question for Daniel, please.
Thank you very much. Governor, you spoke of the shadow banking system effectively being a shadow of itself. I wonder if you could look forward to the role of shadow banking system, not only in the US, but perhaps in Europe as well. Considering that it used to be around 5 trillion at the pre-crisis levels, and it has shrunk to maybe a half that, with tremendous contractionary impact, which I'm sure the Federal Reserve and others have taken into account in terms of monetary policy that has been carried out since. I'm trying to quantify the impact of the contraction through the virtual demise of the shadow banking system. It's not dead yet, as you know, it's coming
Right,
back.
no, not the least. So I think, you know, we have, whenever we think, it's hard to think about baselines and normals. Because if we have unconsciously in our mind that, well, things are only 70% of the way to where they were in, say, 2005, that's in the financial arena, that's probably not a very good metric. Because there was a bunch of stuff going on that was not sustainable, that was not well-grounded. So a lot of what we now think of as shadow banking, with the infamous sieves that I alluded to a few moments ago, was not, if I can put it this way, it was not healthy, well-grounded economic and financial activity. So it's hard to know where things, quote, should be, just as it's sometimes hard to know where debt levels should be, and you can't just do a straight line extrapolation from the past and say, well, that's the trend, that's where we should be. Having said that, I think that, as I noted a little while back, we can expect more growth in things that can be denominated as part of the shadow banking system over the course of the next 10 years. And indeed, I would say that if we don't see that, we're probably going to be very unhappy for a variety of other reasons, which is say we're going to have very stagnant economies that are not creating opportunities for different kinds of funding through capital markets. I think the issue continues to be that the last 15 years or so in the US and to a lesser degree in other parts of the world saw such an integration between traditional lending functions and capital markets that regulatory approaches didn't effectively capture the risks that were involved. You know, we somehow thought that if the stuff was not on the balance sheet of the bank, or of course it's sometimes round-tripped back, but if it had been originated and then put off, even if it were funded in markets that were runnable, we didn't need to be worried about that. We learned to our dismay that that was not the case. That is not to say that it is not healthy to have funding systems, capital markets, lending that are integrated and that operate sometimes in connection with and sometimes wholly apart from large regulated financial institutions. But what I think Jean-Claude and I were both saying a little while back was we are going to have to be more self-critical in our monitoring of these as they go forward and avoid both the type 1 and the type 2 errors. I can't tell you that I don't think 5 trillion was right for the economy of 2005. Could it be right for the economy of 2025? Possibly, but certainly not if it has the kind of structures and funding vulnerabilities that the 2005 one did.
Thank you very, very much
Thank you,
indeed,
Jean-Claude.
Daniel. You were very generous.